Evening. Thank you for joining us for this event, which complements an exhibition, Hieroglyphs, Unlocking Ancient Egypt, which is open at the British Museum until the 19th of February. My name is Dan Cruickshank. I've made a series of programs for BBC Television about ancient Egypt, but I've long been fascinated by the ways in which ancient Egypt had influenced the architecture and arts during the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries. Egyptomania, the Egyptian revival in the arts, is a topic explored by this evening's speakers. First, Dr. Benjamin Hinson, an Egyptologist, and short archaeologist too, and a curator of the Middle East section at the Victoria and Albert Museum, invites us to consider tourist arts, that is, art produced locally for consumption by tourists. This trade was stimulated by the rapid growth of visitors to Egypt, largely following on the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Tourist art is generally dismissed as mere kitsch, but as Dr. Hinson considers, these objects are a valid expression of the Egyptian revival, which shows how Egyptians engaged with Western preconceptions of Egypt. Then Dr. Anna Ferrari, the curator of art and visual culture at the Science Museum, and with Dr. Hinson, the co-curator in 2022 of the exhibition Visions of Ancient Egypt, that was shown at the Sainsbury Centre in Norwich. She will discuss 20th century modernist artists such as Alberto Giacometti, Henry Moore, and the Egyptian sculptor Mahmoud Mokhtar, who have all looked to ancient Egypt for inspiration. The question explored is whether or not these artists' engagement with ancient Egypt is an authentic expression of Egyptomania, or just an example of the way in which all artists take inspiration from all manner of sources. Finally, Dr. Chris Elliott, the author of the 2012 English heritage publication, Egypt in England, will review more than 200 years of the cultural legacy of ancient Egypt expressed through architecture, ranging from mills to mausoleums, from cinemas to synagogues and Masonic halls. Now to the audience, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to put forward questions. Now, time is short, so over to Ben.
Thank you, Dan. So I have the rather unenviable task, first of all, of trying to sum up some 2,000 years of the history of the legacy of Egypt in art and design, which is a story that itself begins with ancient Rome. So Egypt was embedded in ancient Roman life, especially after the Romans conquered it and turned it into a province of the empire in 30 BC. Egypt was both part of Rome, but also other. The Romans engaged with Egypt in multiple ways. Monuments were looted as political statements. Classical authors wrote about Egypt and its gods, many of whom became part of the Roman pantheon, and new objects were made in Rome in an Egyptianizing style. All of this ancient material was rediscovered in the Renaissance as part of the rediscovery of classical antiquity more generally. And at a time when few people had traveled to Egypt firsthand, these objects in Rome were their only real direct encounter with Egypt and formed most of the earliest European understandings. However, this was Egypt seen through a Roman lens and understood as part of the classical world. Most commonly, Egyptianizing objects made by the Romans were misunderstood as actual Egyptian objects, and this distorted Roman view of Egypt would continue for centuries. In the Renaissance, as this Egyptian material was rediscovered, religious elites and political elites began repurposing Egyptian iconography to suit their own agendas. The classical authors presented Egypt as the birthplace of law and order, and therefore to link yourself with Egypt was to enhance your own legitimacy to rule. Perhaps the most overt example of this, which we can see on the left, is the papal reappropriation of obelisks. Similar to the Roman emperors, popes re-erected obelisks and gave them new political meaning as symbols of papal Christian authority. Alongside artworks, classical texts were rediscovered which portrayed Egypt as a land of philosophy. Hieroglyphs were often described as a system, an allegorical system that the priests invented to preserve but also conceal their ancient knowledge. And therefore, this fostered ideas of Egypt as the place of sacred and true wisdom. Hieroglyphs were not a language, but pictorial representations of secrets and knowledge. These ideas had a profound influence on Renaissance art and led to a development of a system of neo-hieroglyphs, basically new compositions, new symbols expressing philosophical ideas based on Renaissance attempts at translating actual hieroglyphs. Many neo-hieroglyphic dictionaries were written to aid artists and writers composing their own works. And these sorts of symbols appear in all sorts of Renaissance artworks and in the works of Renaissance authors, an interest that spread beyond Italy into the rest of Europe. From the 17th century, small numbers of Europeans began visiting Egypt to see the sites of the biblical stories. The remains, which visitors saw, were in turn illustrated in vivid, descriptive travelogues when they returned, giving European artists another source of inspiration alongside the monuments in Rome. However, those who drew the illustrations hadn't themselves been to Egypt. The accuracy of their reconstructions is often limited and based on popular legends as much as the written text. These misconceptions about Egypt were in turn reflected by artists who used these books and these prints as source material. For example, the example here, Wedgwood, pioneered Egyptian designs in Britain, but he never actually visited Egypt himself. His designs were based on prints from his personal library, many of which drew Roman objects, which had been misunderstood as accurately Egyptian because of their decoration. A major shift in attitudes occurred at the turn of the 19th century. Strategically placed on the route to India, Egypt became a site of Franco-British imperial competition. Napoleon Bonaparte invaded in 1798, which was a military disaster but spun as an academic success. A contingent of scholars accompanying the expedition made an encyclopedic study of Egypt, which was published in the groundbreaking Description de l'Egypte. In imposing a rational order on Egypt, this reflected French imperial ambitions to control it. Another key French publication was Baron Dominique Vivant-Denon's Voyage dans la Basse et la Haute Egypte. An artist, a collector, and a diplomat, Denon joined Bonaparte's expedition, and this account of his travels was hugely influential, inspiring imperial French design, as you can see here. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, the British defeated the French in Egypt, and Egyptian motifs such as crocodiles and pyramids became incorporated and popular in British art and design, often with overtones of victory and imperial triumph. In the late 19th century, colonial influences grew even stronger. In 1882, the British assumed de facto control of Egypt, something called a veiled protectorate, where Egypt's viceroy remained ruler in name, but Britain ruled in practice. New technologies, such as photography, brought Egypt to ever wider audiences at home, crystallizing now iconic images like Abu Simbel, the pyramids, and the Sphinx, and very often looking back to earlier watercolors, as you can see here, aiming explicitly to emulate them. Reflecting these colonial ambitions, Egypt also became a subject of display. Music hall and theatre popularized ideas of the mummy, and world fairs showcased Egypt to the masses, linking it with spectacle and scale. These exhibitions, as well as spectacular archaeological discoveries, captured the public's imagination and increasingly inspired designers of furniture and textiles and jewelry. Now, of course, no overview of Egyptomania and the idea of textiles and fashion really can avoid the 1920s. In 1902, Tutankhamun was almost unknown. In 1922, he became a global celebrity. His discovery enthralled the world and sparked an unprecedented obsession with ancient Egypt that touched all aspects of popular culture, feeding into the burgeoning Art Deco trend and coinciding with the golden age of tourist travel to Egypt. Which is where I want to zoom in somewhat from broad history to a much more specific topic and explore a type of object many of you may have seen before, even in your own homes, an object called khayamia, or Egyptian appliques, one of the most interesting, but I think overlooked examples of the Egyptian revival in a crafts context. So made in Egypt, these objects, khayamia, represent a centuries-old Egyptian craft responding to mass tourism from the late 19th century onwards. They were an inexpensive, colourful, portable souvenir decorated with pharaonic images immediately recognizable to tourist audiences. Rather than reflecting how Western art and design adopted Egyptian imagery, they reflect how Egyptian craftsmen responded to this pharaonic heritage, and in some ways encouraged Western visions of Egypt centered around its ancient past in light of the commercial opportunities of tourism. Now, Khayyamiyya are one of the most common examples of touristic Egyptomania. They're found widely in private homes, and they appear at auctions quite often also. But they're typically seen as folk art or tourist art, lacking cultural authenticity. And in this talk, I really just hope to draw a little more attention to this fascinating but often overlooked type of object, and argue that these so-called tourist arts are equally worthy of a place within narratives of the reception of Egypt. So the art of making Khayyamiyya, from the Arabic word khayma, tent, is one of the most enduring crafts in Egypt. It's a colourful textile applique where cut-out cotton designs are hand-sewn onto a linen backing, not dissimilar to European quilting. Now, it's a vibrant and a living craft today with practitioners, who are primarily men, based in the stalls of Cairo's Street of the Tent Makers, near the Bab Zuwaylah, one of Cairo's main gates, where the craft has, as you can see in this watercolour, traditionally always been practiced. However, the craft actually has a long historical legacy stretching back centuries, if not millennia. As the link to the word tent suggests, Khayyamiyya were historically architectural. They were used to create both the large tents and pavilions, which have long played an important role in Egypt's social, political, and religious life, and also curtains and hangings, screens and awnings. These tents varied in scale from the monumental, dozens of panels stitched together for hosting feasts and festivals, to smaller individual versions. So the importance of tents in Egypt is attested since at least the 11th century, where records of the Egyptian palace storerooms note a vast number. Some of them were huge. One tent in particular, called the Tent of Deliverance, was recorded as 2,100 feet wide. Tent making was a craft patronaged by royalty to create portable court architecture of staggering size. The scale of these complexes and the logistics required to assemble and disassemble them can't be overstated. None of these tents survive today, but a good visual parallel can be drawn with European medieval tent complexes, such as those famously created for Henry VIII at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a picture of which I've got here. Now, these early tents were made in sumptuous silk, velvet, metal brocades rather than applique. However, other surviving textiles do suggest that applique was beginning to be used around this time for ceremonial contexts. By the Mamluk period, beginning about 1250 AD, there's much greater evidence of applique, and tents commissioned by some of the Mamluk sultans are described as being applique detailed. The closest precedent for Egyptian Khayyamiyya more properly, however, are the lavishly decorated tents of the Ottomans, like the example on the bottom right, who conquered Egypt in 1517. Even further back, tantalizing echoes of applique exist since pharaonic times. Animal mummies were sometimes decorated with linen appliques. Before this, a princess called Iset-em-Kheb of the 21st dynasty, so around 1000 BC, owned a monumental tent of appliqued coloured leather. Even earlier still, there were two types of applique found in textiles from the tomb of Tutankhamun, one of which used sort of flat cut-out shapes stitched to the fabric, is identical to the Khayyamiyya practice today. So in short, what I'm trying to suggest here is that the art of applique has an ancient heritage in Egypt spanning some 2.5 millennia, and the making of touristic Khayyamiyya is simply an evolution of that ancient heritage. So into the modern era, the nature of Khayyamiyya expanded to exploit new commercial opportunities. A small but steady stream of leisure tourists had visited Egypt since at least 1815. However, the end of the 19th century witnessed the birth of mass tourism. Thomas Cook's package holidays revolutionized excursions to Egypt. Cook's first group visited Cairo in 1869, and by 1880 his company had exclusive control of the entire Egyptian government's fleet of Nile steamers, and therefore complete control of passenger traffic. Now, these visitor numbers, of course, translated to business. By 1922, it's estimated that tourists were spending $10 million yearly in Egypt. Khayyamiyya makers were quick to respond to this. They began making smaller panels at a lower price alongside their traditional work. Unlike the traditional geometric and Islamic designs of Khayyamiyya, these smaller pieces predominantly featured pharaonic motifs alongside folkloric images, palm trees, peasants on camels. They were inexpensive to buy and could easily be carried home in a suitcase, and, being quicker and cheaper to make, therefore represented better profits for the tent makers also. As well as expanding the decorative repertoire, these new pieces also represented a change in function. Rather than architectural textiles, these were primarily decorative, although there are larger examples of tents in a pharaonic style, like the bottom example here, one of the most stunning pieces. Likewise, pieces that continued to be made for domestic consumption sometimes incorporated pharaonic images. There wasn't therefore a binary distinction between domestic and touristic. Rather, these new markets expanded the artistic repertoire available to craftsmen, and cultural encounters created a new hybrid material. Importantly, however, this orientalizing pharaonic view of Egypt was one engaged with and almost encouraged by the tent makers themselves, reinterpreted on their own terms. In other words, these new touristic Khayyamiyya were the physical outcome of interactions between Egyptians and tourists, representing not just touristic perceptions of Egypt, but how tent makers imagined touristic perceptions of Egypt to be. Once introduced abroad, they garnered great interest. Their popularity was such that British department stores even imported Khayyamiyya en masse to sell to customers back home, setting up agencies in Egypt where panels were transported, collected, and shipped to England. Now, the impact of this mass import was twofold. Firstly, it made Khayyamiyya more widely accessible without having to go to Egypt directly, in effect domesticating them as high street goods for the home. However, secondly, the growing commodification of these panels by department stores meant that their sales primarily benefited non-Egyptians, as there was an inevitable markup in price. Newspaper and magazine articles chart the growing consumption of domestic Khayyamiyya, not just as souvenirs, but as part of a wider body of Egyptianizing material available to decorate the home and marketed increasingly at women. They were widely advertised in early 20th century craft and design magazines, where, as well as extolling the design virtues of the panels, instructions helped readers to make their own pieces inspired by them. The techniques and designs of Khayyamiyya also inspired their use in fashion, divorced from the original panel context. Into the 1920s, as fashion inspired by Egypt became ubiquitous, the impact of Khayyamiyya remained especially strong. So the visual sources used by Khayyamiyya makers were similar to those accessible to Western tourists and to which helped shape their own visions of Egypt. Postcards, illustrated guidebooks, art books, as much as the visible monuments themselves. These were all ready-to-hand references to the craftsmen in Cairo's bazaar. Some motifs proved particularly popular. Specific scenes taken from tomb walls were frequently copied, such as this frieze of birds from the tomb of an individual called Khnumhotep II at Beni Hassan, a popularity that persists today, as you can see here. This tomb was well known by the time tent makers turned their attention to Egypt and was widely illustrated. Donkeys were also very popular, another motif often found in ancient tombs. Perhaps their popularity was in part because they were relevant to contemporary Egyptian life also. However, usually, rather than looking at specific scenes, tent makers freely mixed and matched sequences of images from different sources, rendering them freely and schematically. Hieroglyphs became simpler, often illegible. Designs which the craftsmen did not understand were misrepresented or improvised, and motifs which in the ancient canon wouldn't necessarily be seen together were combined side by side to make new overall compositions, very similar to how historical European designers treated Egypt. Now, this free interpretation of scenes can make it quite difficult to trace what objects and what images makers were sometimes looking to when making their Khayyamiyya. However, in some cases, the inspiration is explicit. And I want to turn my attention here to just one such example. So the top of this panel, as you can see, has an obelisk, a palm tree, and a pillar. Now, the hieroglyphs on the panel aren't accurately copied from any one source. Rather, the maker wanted to give the general impression of an inscribed obelisk. But some of the signs are rendered clearly enough to be able to show that the maker did look to a specific object, or at least a type of object, for inspiration, even if the text isn't the sort that would usually be found on obelisks. In particular, the top two signs of the column are a rendering of the phrase "Jed Medu in," words spoken by, which are typically followed by a divine or a royal name. Further down the panel, there's a sequence of signs involving a bee, which seems to be a rendering of the phrase king of Upper and Lower Egypt, and indeed you can also see a cartouche. And another sequence of signs involving a scarab beetle and a sun disk, which seem to be a rendering of the throne name of a particular pharaoh, Thutmosis III. All of these clues, even though they've been somewhat illegibly rendered, suggest that a royal inscription from the Thutmoside period, probably a stela, was the source material for this text. Besides the tree is a colourful column topped with a red, white and grey-green pillar. These closely resemble the pillars from the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak. This was a key tourist destination that had been painted and then photographed for decades, and therefore images of these pillars were readily accessible. But it's the very bottom of the panel that I think is most interesting, and I would argue is based on one specific object, which is a pectoral, a piece of jewelry belonging to a princess called Sit Hathor Unit. The similarity between the two designs is too close to be coincidental. Notice especially that the king's name in the cartouche here is rendered completely clearly, unlike the symbols on the obelisk higher up on the panel. Both are flanked by similar falcons, and on the Khayyamiyya, there's at first what looks like an unclear design, a sequence of blue and white vertical lines, but I think is a sort of misrendering of the design underneath the cartouche on this panel, which represents the god He, or infinity. All of these images, all of these similarities point to this particular pectoral as the original inspiration for the Khayyamiyya, rendered somewhat faithfully. And copying from this also makes sense in terms of dating. This piece of jewelry was discovered in 1914 at the site of Lahoun. Its discovery and its shipment to England were at first treated with utmost secrecy, but when the jewelry was displayed in London in summer 14, it made worldwide headlines and was illustrated in the press across the world. By contrast, this Khayyamiyya was purchased by the owner in 1919, giving the pectoral just enough time to have become disseminated and reached Egypt also. Images would have been readily accessible to craftsmen. And so this is one of the rare cases where we can chart the transmission from object to print to emulation. So in conclusion, these applique panels may at first seem humble, but are actually a really rich example of an often overlooked but important manifestation of the Egyptian revival within Egypt itself, one which illustrates craftsmen engaging directly with, and in turn helping to further propagate, touristic perceptions of Egypt. Thank you very much.
Well, Ben, brilliant. Thank you. Gosh, so much stuff, so much information. So tourist art is a creative continuation of ancient Egyptian craft traditions. Absolutely fascinating. I should look at the stalls in Luxor with a different eyes now. But Anna Ferrari, you're going to take us forward. So over to you now. Hello.
Thank you, Dan. I'm just going to get the presentation up. Great. So Benjamin has just explored the long history of European interest in ancient Egypt and wrote a particular case study. But in the next few minutes, I'd like to take you on another journey, exploring how 20th century artists reinvented ancient Egypt and drew on it in different ways to reflect their own interests and priorities. So the 19th century art development in Europe was really influenced by the development of archaeological excavations, together with growing colonial interest in Egypt, which further spurred interest in ancient Egypt. So this was the backdrop to much art of the 19th century. So think of romantic landscapes of Egyptian ruins or titillating nudes set in an imagined ancient Egypt. But in the 1920s and 30s, modern artists, and especially sculptors, adopted a different approach. So in the next few minutes, I want to look at three parallel stories of modern artists working in those decades, the 20s and the 30s, in three different regions of the world, and look at what ancient Egypt meant to them. So first we'll start in Paris and London, before going to Harlem in the United States, and then coming to Cairo. But I'll start with Paris, because in the 19th and early 20th century, it was the center of the art world and the home of the avant-garde. And that meant that it attracted artists from around the world. The idealized classical nude, which had been central to Western academic art tradition, so the reference to Greco-Roman nudes since the Renaissance really started to lose its preeminence. And instead, modern artists started looking towards other artistic traditions, often from outside Europe, so from Asia, Africa, and the Pacific region. But modern artists' wider visual landscape also included ancient Egypt. So it was both a geographic and a chronological expansion of the canon. For example, the sculptor Auguste Rodin looked to a broad range of artistic traditions, which he reflected in his own collection. And the photograph you can see at the moment is a photograph of a very small part of his vast collection. So he owned works, thousands of works, including some more traditional nudes, classical nudes like on the left, as well as Egyptian sculptures and reliefs, which you can see on the right-hand side and on the floor. And actually at the moment, there's an exhibition at the Musée Rodin in Paris exploring in particular Rodin's interest in ancient Egypt and his collection. So for artists in Europe, the colonial context shaped the way in which such modern artists encountered non-Western arts, including ancient Egyptian art. Many never actually traveled to Egypt, but they visited imperial collections that had been developed in the 19th century. They saw private collections and owned illustrated books. And this was particularly the case for Alberto Giacometti, for whom ancient Egypt was a major visual reference. And Giacometti first came face to face with ancient Egyptian works when he traveled to Florence and visited the Archaeological Museum as a young artist in 1920. And then he moved to Paris in 1922, where he became a lifelong visitor of the Louvre and its Egyptian rooms. So an Egyptian influence can be seen in many of his sculptures, including this bust on the right, which is a bust of his muse and friend, Isabelle Rawsthorne. In 1936, Isabelle sat for her bust, which later acquired the nickname tête égyptienne, so Egyptian head, which is probably because of its frontality and the simplification of form and the sitter's serene expression, which recall Egyptian busts. But in this juxtaposition with the bust of Nefertiti, I wanted to draw out a particular similarity in the way the figure is posed and with the long, elegant, elongated neck. So the bust of Queen Nefertiti had been excavated in 1912. It was transported illegally to Germany, and the bust was first publicly exhibited in 1924, which meant that Giacometti could have seen it. And it became instantly famous. And at the same time, it prompted Egyptian restitution claims, which continue to this day. Moving across the channel to London, the British Museum's collections became a focus for modernist sculptors. Two sculptors in particular, who lived around the same time, Henry Moore and Ronald Moody, claimed that the British Museum's Egyptian collections played a crucial role in their formative years. And interestingly, both describe their visits to the British Museum in the 1920s in a language of almost religious revelation that sort of underlines their rejection of academic models and highlights their association with modernism. Moore was a sculpture student from Yorkshire when he first visited the British Museum in 1920 and discovered its Egyptian collections. He moved to London shortly after and continued exploring the museum. Women with upraised arms, of 1924-25 reveals more engaging with the formal qualities of ancient Egyptian sculpture, but also departing from them. It's carved directly into a single block of stone that's called Hopton wood stone, which gives it a compact quality that's similar to Egyptian stone carved figures. But Moore has created a void between the arms, which is something you wouldn't see in Egyptian sculpture. So in this work, it's possible that Moore was inspired by the monumental 3-meter long red granite arm in the British Museum's collection. Next slide, please. Later in his career, Moore remembered the impact of this sculpture when he recalled that when he first visited the museum and saw the great arm, he imagined what the whole figure was like, and which it had been only part of. And then I realized how monumental, how enormous, how impressive a single piece of sculpture could be. What I found in the Egyptian piece was a monumentality, a vision. So that helps us appreciate what Moore saw in Egyptian art. Ronald Moody was a close contemporary of Moore, and the British Museum's collections were equally important to him. He was born in Jamaica in 1900 and arrived in London in 1923, originally to study dentistry, but he soon discovered sculpture and then devoted his life to it. And he remembered the turning point in his career when he visited the Egyptian rooms at the British Museum in 1928. And he describes how he had a sudden revelation in those rooms and felt that sculpture was his real medium. In this wood-carved sculpture, it partly recalls the restrained frontal posture of Pharaonic sculpture, but also the sense of stillness of those works, which Moody particularly admired. But perhaps this influence wouldn't be as that evident were it not for the sculptor's explicit admiration of Egyptian art in his interviews and lectures, and also the sketches of Egyptian objects in his archives. So for Moody and Moore, it was almost a modernist reference to evoke Egyptian art in rejection of academic standards and Greco-Roman sculpture. Across the Atlantic, ancient Egypt held great significance for African-American artists and intellectuals. Ancient Egypt was perceived as a great African civilization and inspired great pride in African-American culture at a time when many remained oppressed and segregated. The cultural movement that emerged in the 1920s and 1930s, known as the Harlem Renaissance, celebrated the Black experience and its creative contributions to the arts, the literature, music, and encouraged artists to look at African art. Two artists in particular reflected an interest in Egyptian art, including Meta Warwick Fuller, who was an African-American sculptor. She was educated in America and then studied in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century. And there she visited Rodin's studio, which left a deep impression on her. So she may even have seen his collection of Egyptian art. Back in America, Fuller was commissioned to sculpt an allegorical figure of Ethiopia for the African-American booth at a fair called America's Making Exposition in 1921. Fuller's Ethiopia is a powerful figure of a standing Black woman wearing a pharaonic nemes headdress. She appears to emerge from unraveling mummy wrappings, turning her head as if coming back to life. The sculptor herself explained the importance of the ancient Egyptian reference as a symbol of African-American emancipation. And she wrote around the time she was making the sculpture, here was a group who had once made history and now, after a long sleep, was awaking, gradually unwinding the bandage of its mummied past and looking out on life again. Why, you may ask, the Egyptian motif? The answer, the most brilliant period, perhaps, of Egyptian history was the period of the Negro kings. So today the word Negro is a racist insult, but at the time it didn't have this connotation and was used to refer to African Americans. And here Fuller was invoking a period of Egyptian history in the 8th century BC, when Black Africans from Nubia ruled Egypt. So Fuller reclaimed a prestigious ancient Egyptian history as part of an African heritage that African Americans could look up to. In a similar way, from the mid-1920s, the painter Aaron Douglas too drew on ancient Egyptian visual culture to create a powerful representation of the modern African American experience. Next slide, please. He developed a style that drew on Cubism's flattened space and the graphic outlines of Art Deco. And his painting of 1944, Building More Stately Mansions, is a rousing vision of African-American labor set against ancient Egyptian achievement. So in the foreground, you can see silhouetted figures wielding tools. And behind them are great awe-inspiring arches, spires, and skyscrapers that evoke modern achievement. And then behind that, you can see the silhouette of a pharaoh and a pyramid that stand for a great ancestral African culture. So in this way, Douglas seems to collapse the centuries, drawing a direct connection between ancient Egypt's great architecture and modern African Americans' achievements. So for African Americans in the United States, ancient Egypt conveyed a powerful and hopeful message about emancipation that was quite different from the formal concerns among artists working in Paris and London. And now moving to our final destination in Egypt. In the 1920s in Egypt, ancient Egypt also proved influential among modernists, but again for very different reasons. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 happened at a time of rising nationalism in Egypt, only 3 years after the Egyptian Revolution and with ongoing demands for independence from Britain. The extraordinary objects discovered in the tomb were a reminder of a powerful and independent and glorious Egypt, and Tutankhamun could be reinvented as an icon of Egyptian independence. The discovery also spurred a political and artistic movement known as Pharaonism, which drew connections between pharaonic and modern Egyptian times. The sculptor Mahmoud Mokhtar, who you can see in this picture standing on the scaffolding, adding the finishing touches to his monumental work, was born in 1891. And he was one of Egypt's great modernist artists who participated in Pharaonism and visually referenced the country's ancient past. Mokhtar received a Western-style education, academic arts education in Cairo, before being awarded a scholarship to study in Paris before the First World War. In 1928, his monumental sculpture, which you see here, Egypt's Awakening, was unveiled outside Cairo's main train station in a ceremony attended by thousands. This work is made of red granite, and the motif of the rising sphinx are both direct references to ancient Egypt, while the motif of the figure of the woman raising her veil refers to modernity and alludes to the Egyptian women's movement that campaigned against British occupation. Mokhtar therefore created a symbolic representation of Egypt's perceived political and cultural renaissance, bridging millennia between ancient and modern times. On a more human scale, a smaller scale, Mokhtar also created a personification of Egypt in this work, The Bride of the Nile, invoking the Nile River and pharaonic motifs such as the feathered headdress or the scarab jewelry worn by the figure. So the combination of pharaonic motifs, but also the very European style nude and the stylized profile and gracefully curved neck are really references to Mokhtar's academic education in Paris. So this work can be seen as an example of what art historian Nadia Radwan has described as his trans-Mediterranean style, both engaging with European traditions and drawing on ancient Egypt to create a style fitting for an independent Egypt. So in conclusion, in this short presentation, I wanted to give a snapshot of 3 parallel stories about modern artists' relationship with ancient Egyptian art across 3 regions over the period of about 2 decades. While in Paris and London, ancient Egyptian art was part of a wider visual repertoire that signaled modernist credentials and was embraced for formal reasons. Among artists of the Harlem Renaissance, it was a powerful symbol to reclaim a rich and prestigious African past. And in Egypt, it was embraced at a moment when modern Egypt sought a new style to reflect its identity and modernity. Thank you.
Oh, gosh, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, revelation, the elemental, the abstract, and the monumental in modernism rooted in ancient Egypt, and of course its relevance to African American art, and of course to Egyptians' sense of its own identity and independence in the 20th century. Really absolutely fascinating. Now, Chris Elliott, the final speaker, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and hello everyone. Can we have the title slide, please? Right. One of the things that fascinates me about Egyptomania is the architecture it's inspired. Now, we've got limited time today, so what I'd like to do is to talk about that, focusing on examples specifically in England. But before we start to look at examples of modern buildings in Egyptian style, we need to ask ourselves, what are we talking about when we talk about real ancient Egyptian architecture? So can we have the second slide, please? Now, most of what has survived from ancient Egypt is its stone-built temples, and it was specific features of these that were borrowed to create modern buildings in the Egyptian style. And we can see them here in this photo of the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt. Working from the top downwards, you've got this overhanging top to the building, what's technically known as a cavetto cornice. You've got these half-round mouldings, what they call torus mouldings, running along the top, down the sides. The sides of the building slope, what's called battered sides. You can just about make out here, over the doors of temples, there were winged sun discs, winged solar discs, flanked by rearing cobras. And of course, you've got these very distinctive plant form columns, usually based on the papyrus plant, but sometimes, as you can see here, based on palm columns as well. Now, next slide, please. We can't forget the most distinctive of ancient Egyptian architectural forms. We have pyramids as well, okay? So next slide. The vast majority of Egyptian style buildings in England date from after the French invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1798. And one of the first was this one here, the Egyptian Hall in London's Piccadilly, which was originally built as a commercial museum. And we can see right from the start these key features being used here. Again, working from the top downwards. We've got cavetto cornice. We've got other ones over the windows. We've got winged sun discs over the windows, over the entrance. We've got torus mouldings. The ones on the sides suggest that the building has sloping sides, even though it doesn't. And down at the entrance, we've got a couple of papyrus bud columns or pillars. Next slide, please. You also had pyramids. Now, they're not a very practical form for buildings, but they are quite good for monuments. And this one here is the monument of the late 18th century Member of Parliament, Jack Fuller, known to his contemporaries as Mad Jack. Next slide, please. So the Egyptian style became popular in cemeteries, and particularly in the commercial cemeteries which were set up around London to replace, in the 19th century, to replace burial in parish churchyards, which by that point were literally full to overflowing. There weren't that many cemetery buildings in the Egyptian style, but one that we've got here is the very famous Egyptian Avenue at Highgate Cemetery. And if you look on the left, above a couple of papyrus bud columns, we've got a section of cavetto cornice, and round the entrance, we've got some Taurus mouldings. Next slide, please. But the most popular use in cemeteries was for monuments. And I picked one of the most elaborate here, which is in Kensal Green in London. And it's the family monument of the equestrian showman, Andrew Ducrot, a man known to his contemporaries as the Shakespeare of the sawdust. There's an awful lot going on here, but you should be able to pick out, amongst everything else, we've got a cavetto cornice running around it. We've got sections of Taurus moulding. We've got a couple of what I think are intended to be palm columns here. And in front of it, we've got a couple of distinctively Egyptian sphinxes. Next slide, please. Now, one application that the Egyptian style has hardly been used for at all is residential buildings. And even in this rare example, which is from London's Richmond Avenue, the houses themselves are basically pretty standard 19th century, mid-19th century terraced houses. What makes this an Egyptian style development is the decorative features that have been added out front, these stubby obelisks and the distinctively Egyptian style sphinxes. Next slide, please. I promised you mills in the sense of factories, and this is the superb office building which is attached to Marshall's Mill in Leeds, also known as Temple Mill. Now, from the top downwards again, you've got the cavetto cornice, you've got a couple of very impressive winged sun discs flanked by rearing cobras. You've got another one over the entrance, sloping or battered sides, Taurus mouldings, papyrus columns, and you might just notice in between the columns, you've got these screen walls, which you may remember seeing in that photo of the Temple of Horus from Upper Egypt. This is one of the most archaeologically accurate Egyptian style buildings in England because it was designed by the Egyptologist Joseph Bonamy Jr., who originally trained as a sculptor. And the next slide, please. Another factory, if you like, a cigarette mill, is what's now called Greater London House, but which was built as the factory, the Arcadia works of the cigarette manufacturers Carreras Rothman. Now, you know what you're looking for now, so let's start ticking them off together. We've got a cavetto cornice along the top. We've got the Taurus mouldings. We've got the papyrus bud columns. We've got, interestingly, extensive use of colour, which you would have got in ancient Egyptian temples. And you might just, no, I don't think you can see them behind the caption box, but there are actually flanking the entrance, a couple of large, oh, thank you very much, there are a couple of large statues of the Egyptian cat goddess Bastet, which linked into the black cat trademark of Carreras Rothman, and that trademark was repeated in roundels across the front of the building above the columns. And the next slide, please. Now, this is a real interesting piece of architecture. It's the now sadly demolished Sainsbury's Homebase DIY superstore, formerly in Warwick Road in London. And it had Egyptian style features around the entrance. But the bit that I want to draw your attention to is this magnificent carved limestone frieze of Egyptian gods and goddesses that ran down the side, complete, very unusually, with readable hieroglyphs. Most unusual, that. Now, you should be able to see that all of the gods and goddesses are holding in their hand the Ankh hieroglyph, which is also, it's read as Ankh, the word for life, with one exception. The third god from the right, the jackal-headed god Set, was originally carrying an Ankh, but because it was a DIY superstore, the Ankh was recarved into a power drill, which was promptly nicknamed the Ankh and Decker. So I'll leave you that one. And the next slide, please. Now, if you wanted to see genuine ancient Egyptian architecture in England, you could see elements in museums, but the one place for a long time you could see actual examples was the Egyptian court at the Crystal Palace, where you had reproductions in plaster of elements from tombs and temples all across Egypt, some at full size, some at reduced size. And this meant that architects, artists, anybody who wanted to be inspired by ancient Egyptian architecture could actually get as close to it as you could without going to Egypt. Next slide, please. I promised you synagogues as well. Little bit of a cheat. There's only one in England, a few elsewhere in the world, but this one in Canterbury has got a cavetto cornice across the top, mouldings down the side and on the top, little bit angular, but of the right form, papyrus bud columns, obelisk gate posts to finish the whole thing off. It's actually a false front because that is actually the side of the building, but it's got all the features we expect. Now, given the biblical narrative of the Exodus, you might find the Egyptian style a pretty strange one for a synagogue. But apparently when it was built, the Egyptian style was preferable to the currently fashionable Gothic style. Go figure. And the next slide, please. The idea that Freemasonry had its origins in ancient Egypt has now been largely discredited, but at one time was quite popular, which led to this lodge, the Lodge of Harmony at Boston in Lincolnshire, being built in Egyptian style. All the features we're looking for here, cavetto cornice, magnificent winged sun disk flanked by rearing cobras, Taurus mouldings, battered sides, palm columns rather than papyrus columns, and again, most unusually, readable hieroglyphic inscriptions above the columns and several of them on the columns themselves. Next slide, please. At one time, there were a number of Egyptian style cinemas across the country, several of them in London, with Egyptian style interiors and exteriors, but interestingly, never the two together, never a fully Egyptian cinema. The only one of London's that survives is this one, the former Carlton Cinema in Essex Road. And we have the cavetto cornice, the Taurus mouldings, battered sides on the window elements, papyrus bud columns, and like the Carreras Rothman building, extensive use of color, harking back to the interior of Egyptian temples, but this time, rather than being done with paintwork, it was done with this magnificent colored tile work. Now, final slide, please. I've shown you what I like to think of as the what, the when, and the where of Egyptian style architecture in England. But that leaves us with a question of why. Why was the style used? Now, that's unfortunately a bigger question than we've got time for here today, but I will give you a couple of ideas to take away, a couple of things to think about, accompanied by a couple of thoughtful looking sphinxes from the remains of the Crystal Palace. Firstly, we're dealing with a very long-running tradition. This goes back well before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, in some cases back even before Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, which popularized ancient Egypt throughout Europe. It's been used for a wide variety of types of building. Interestingly, in England, certainly, it's never been used for major civic buildings. Slightly different abroad, but it's not something that is used much for civic buildings. It's tended to be used for monumental buildings and also for commercial buildings of various sorts. Why was that? Well, I'd suggest that what it did was to associate these buildings with a lot of the qualities that we associate with ancient Egypt. Its age, its exoticism, its wealth, its supposed wisdom, particularly its supposed occult wisdom, and its obsession, as it was perceived, with the afterlife and rebirth. So I would invite you to look out for examples where you are, and do keep an eye out for the next use of the Nile style, wherever that may be. You know what to look for now. Thank you very much. And I'll hand you back to Dan, who I think is ready for questions.
Ready for questions. I've got lots of them, but I shall suppress myself and direct the questions from the viewers. So look, the first one is from Alan Gluck. I think this is for Ben. I suggest. Question being, were the individual Renaissance neo-hieroglyphs meant to have specific meanings, or were they just an artistic rendering?
So I guess you have to remember that the sort of the Renaissance translations, these new hieroglyphs, were very much based on understandings of Egypt and of the script at a time before they were translated, properly. Nobody actually got an accurate rendering of what hieroglyphs meant, and what people understood then, as opposed to now, where we realize that the script was largely syllabic. Signs stood for words, stood for concepts, but also many of the signs stood for a sound. The sort of predominant understanding was that each symbol encoded a particular idea, a concept, a whole sort of a whole idea within one symbol. And so these new symbols effectively sum that up. The idea of lion means king, or a particularly famous example, which you find on Roman coins, is a sort of dolphin wrapped around an anchor, which became understood as the motto of Emperor Augustus, sort of make haste slowly. And so this pairing of a dolphin and anchor stood for this whole concept, this whole phrase. So hieroglyphs, these neo-hieroglyphs, basically made up a whole sentence in 4 or 5 discrete images, each of which stood for a word or an idea, usually associated, as Chris said, with sort of particularly occult wisdom or spiritualism.
Okay, that great. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to hurtle through this. We've got a few questions, and tragically not much time. This next one from Keith Raffan, directed to Anna, I'm sure. The question is, far more than Giacometti, wasn't Modigliani the artist most influenced by ancient Egypt, about which he was obsessed? He frequently visited the Egyptian collection, the Louvre, and the elongated faces. Oh yes, it seemed to be inspired by the art of Amarna, Akhenaten, etc. So what's your response to that, Anna?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So I had to make a very brutal selection of artists to mention. So the ones I picked are just some examples, but Modigliani was absolutely, as you said, obsessed with Egyptian art around 1911. And we have an account of his friend, Anna Akhmatova, with whom he went to the Louvre, and she wrote later on, after his death in 1918, she said, Modigliani was absolutely obsessed with Egyptian art. He took me to the Louvre and said that this was the most important and nothing else counted. And then he drew my portrait in the Egyptian style. So Modigliani was certainly very influenced by, or expressed his interest and his passion for ancient Egyptian works. But actually, I suppose many artists were at the time. It was what I was trying to convey was that it was a sort of one of those references that many modernist artists invoked to really highlight their distance from the sort of more academic tradition and show that they were looking to other non-Western traditions.
Thank you. I think this is probably the last question, and we haven't got much time. It's from Anonymous. This is for Chris. I can partly answer it myself. It says, was the Egyptian frieze saved or was it smashed? Clears refers to the Sainsbury's. I mean, I remember that, the sensation when that was unveiled. It didn't last long, less than a decade, and I think Sainsbury's was embarrassed about it. It was quite a reaction from various architectural camps at the time. I think it was destroyed. Chris, do you think that's too?
I believe so. To be absolutely honest, I haven't had the heart to go back there and check, but I'm pretty sure it was. I think one of the problems with the use of the Egyptian style, because so much of it has been used for commercial buildings, it's seen as somewhat cheap and tacky. And I think there was an element where when the Sainsbury's home base was originally built, it was felt that it was sort of architecturally not as prestigious as Greco-Roman forms. And I think this is one thing that the Egyptian style has suffered from, but it's been perceived as a bit of a second-class architecture in modern times, because so much of it has been used for private monuments, commercial buildings, and so forth. It's been used for facades for display, rather than, as say with Greco-Roman stuff, with a building like the British Museum, for high prestige civic buildings. So I think that's part of the problem with the use of the Egyptian style in architecture in modern times.
Good answer. I think I'm going to have to look. Thank you very much to all speakers, and thank you, audience, for joining us, and of course for your questions. The exhibition Hieroglyphs Unlocking Ancient Egypt closes on the 19th of February. Do come and see it if you can. There's still time. The next event in this series is on Thursday, the 2nd of February, at the same time, on the subject of ancient Egypt and modern identities. You can book via the museum's website. I hope you enjoyed this evening, and will join us again soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.